Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Have you ever had an abortion, and have you ever, as a woman or the man of someone who's had an abortion, and then you had to be quiet about it, you couldn't really talk about it because society said you couldn't talk about it? Well, we have many people walking around in America who are post-abortive. They've had an abortion for whatever reason. And today we're going to talk with someone who has had an abortion and talk about what goes on afterwards, maybe a week, a year, several decades. It's called post-abortion syndrome. And this lady has shared her story around the United States and around the world, and we're very fortunate to have her today. Well, welcome, Vera Faith Lord.
Well, hello. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing well, thank you, Vera. Vera, how did you ever get involved in this? And I know you were mentioning to me on the phone earlier that you have a ministry now going out and talking to people about what happens to you after you've had an abortion. Could you give us a little bit of background about this whole topic of post-abortion syndrome?
Well, I was 34 years old when it happened to me. I was 21 weeks pregnant, and those who have heard me speak know my entire story, so I'm not going to go into the whole thing. But I had an abortion at 21 weeks. I had felt movement, and I was one of those people. I was the poster child for the so-called justifiable abortion. The doctor that I went to, all my friends, everyone said the same thing. You want to have a child, you just don't want to have one right now. I was abusing drugs and alcohol at the time, so they said, well, you don't want to bring a baby into the world with fetal alcohol syndrome and possibly addicted to cocaine and the other drugs that I was using. And the worst of all was from a minister that I asked for counseling from, and he said, oh, send this baby back to God, where he wants to go. You know, that was probably the worst of all the things that I heard. But I allowed myself to believe it, just like millions and millions of other women do, and I went ahead and I did it.
Were you married at the time?
Yes, I was. I was in a very dysfunctional, abusive marriage, but I was actually legally married at the time.
And I think I remember from listening to your tape or reading your book that you got beat up by your husband to have an abortion?
The night that my son was conceived, I didn't just get him. I got a black eye, a broken jaw, and a broken rib. I was in a very dysfunctional, abusive marriage, and that was just part of my problem. A lot of the women that have abortions for the 1,000,002 reasons that women have them are in abusive situations. Some of them are in perfectly normal situations. So I have a good friend that I call Superwoman that I use as an example when I speak. She had her abortion so she could stay in grad school and get her PhD. And she was living the life of an upper middle class woman at the time with no psychological problems, no abusive relationships. So we run the gamut of, from A to Z of the types of women that can have abortions.
And I know that in your book you mentioned this Superwoman that I guess on the surface everything looked good, but what did you find out? I guess she was a close friend of yours, a reasonably close friend.
Yes,
what did you find out about what was below the surface?
Well, the thing is, you can't tell if someone is post-abortive because we do run the gamut everywhere from Superwoman who's she had her abortion so that she could stay in grad school and get her PhD, and now, 25 years later, she has the perfect house, the perfect husband, the perfect children, the perfect career. She's driven. She's an overachiever, all the way down to the person who is suicidally self-destructive. That was me. I was on that end of the scale. I divorced my abusive husband and entered into an even stupider relationship with another man who was abusive in other ways. I continued to use alcohol and cocaine, but not to the same extent. I sabotaged every career move I ever made after that. And that's typical of people on that end of the scale. If if you know anything about psychology, you know that the way that you think of yourself deep down inside, your self-image, affects the way you deal with the entire world. So post-abortion syndrome doesn't just affect the woman, it affects everybody who's around her, her husband, her children, her friends, her family, her coworkers. It's like a rock that you throw into water. You know, the rock disappears, but the ripples go on into infinity.
Mm-hmm.
It can we get migraines, eating disorders, relationship problems, inability to bond, psychological numbing, all the way down to suicide. Some of us actually take our own lives. So the symptoms are almost too many to count.
And are the symptoms immediate, or do they manifest themselves at different times? What have you seen as a trend as far as post-abortion?
No, they're definitely not immediate. There's as many different variations as there are women. Shortly after the abortion, a really interesting thing happens, Brendan. Mother Nature shows up big time in the form of the strongest instinct on the planet, the maternal instinct. Mm-hmm. I mean, the maternal instinct is stronger than survival. There's thousands of stories about mothers sacrificing themselves to save their child. Well, shortly after the abortion, it can vary. I mean, it can happen 30 seconds later, a week later, a month later. No matter what she's called it, no matter what warm, fuzzy euphemism she's hidden behind to call abortion, you know, terminating a pregnancy, ridding your uterus of the product of conception, you know, I mean, it gets pretty convoluted. No matter what she's called it, at that moment, every cell in her body knows exactly what she has just done, that she's just committed the most unnatural act known to man. She's just killed her own offspring. And it is the worst moment, Brendan, that you can possibly imagine. It's like sticking your hand into fire and holding it there. Okay, and everything in us wants to run away from that moment, and that's what we do. We spend the rest of our lives running away from that realization. That's what post-abortion syndrome is all about. It's the denial. It's the running away from that awful realization of what we have just done.
Well, I mean, society, the pro-abortionists in America say, well, it's your body, it's your right to choose,
sure.
and you know, it's you know, baby. What baby? You know, they don't they don't recognize that it was a baby. How does that affect the woman that's, you know, basically killed her own offspring?
Exactly. If a woman has a child that dies in its crib of some awful disease like sudden infant death syndrome, right? What does society do? Society rallies around her, right? Oh, we all feel so. Oh, poor Mrs. Jones, her baby died, right? We have grieving and mourning. We have sympathy cards. We have a little tiny coffin. We have a funeral. We have everything that goes with the death and dying process. Mm-hmm. Well, the post-abortive woman has a dead child too. Just because she participated in the killing doesn't make the baby any less dead. Okay, but what does society say to her? Society says, you're right, baby, what baby? Now, I have two friends one that I actually grew up with that are psychiatrists, so I know a lot about psychology. And if you know anything about psychology, you know that when you have someone die who's close to you, you must be able to grieve and mourn that death. If you can't, if something prevents you from doing that, you are in serious psychological trouble. They call it impacted grief, and there are people in institutions because of impacted grief. Well, the post-abortive mother doesn't just have impacted grief because she has a dead child. She also has survivor guilt and a whole lot of other things. Society's telling her that she can't grieve and mourn for that child. It's telling her that she can't even acknowledge that that child ever existed in the first place.
Huh. Wow.
So she has...
Where does someone who has had an abortion and they're experiencing this impacted grief or survivor guilt or, you know, psychological and emotional uncomfort, where do they turn? Where do they go? Well, where did you go what was your moment that you turned it around, would you say?
Good question. Good question. We all have our epiphanies. Okay, mine came when I moved from the West Coast back to the East Coast, and I started going to an Orthodox church for the first time in my life. I was raised Methodist, and I had been in every mud hut and ashram and a place that you could go and worship anything called a deity in the world in California, where they have the Religion of the Month Club. But
I lived there for 17 years, so
oh, well,
I know.
you understand that, right?
Yes.
I had gone into this Orthodox Christian church back in Pennsylvania, and I decided that this was where I was supposed to be. I started taking lessons, I started taking classes, and I was getting ready to be chrismated as an Orthodox Christian. And one of the things that you have to do before that happens is you have to go to a confession. Well, I had studied Roman Catholicism, but I had never actually been to a confession before. So I asked Father, I said, how do you do that? And he said, well, make a list of all the things that you've done that you think are sins. And I said, boy, how long does that take? How many days? And where do you sleep? And he chuckled and he said, just, synopsize, do it in general categories, so I did. And at the very end, I tacked on, oh, yeah, and by the way, I had this abortion a few years ago. And there was this dead silence. And I looked over at Father, and in an Orthodox confession, you can see each other because you're in an office. And I looked over at him, and he was crying. I said, Father, why are you crying? He said, I'm crying for your baby. And all of a sudden, that awful sticking your hand into fire moment that I thought was completely brushed under the rug came back, multiplied by about 1,000, and I fell on the floor. I started crying. I didn't stop for about 2 hours. And my Baptist friends told me at that time that I was saved. And my 2 psychiatrist friends told me at that time I had a great psychological breakthrough. And what happened was I got angry. After the confession, I was driving home, and I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe there's a name for this thing that's been ruining my life all these years since I had the abortion. Maybe there's a name for this thing that's giving me migraines and eating disorders and relationship problems and all the rest. So I went straight to the library. I mean, this was 1995, before everybody had computers in every house. I went straight to the library, and I started doing some research. And I found out at that time, back then, there were like 9 books and over 11 or 12 different national organizations just for people, men and women, with post-abortion syndrome. And then I got even angrier because I had never heard this thing was ruining my life, and I had never even heard of it.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I would be willing to bet that most of your audience, even if they have been in the pro-life movement for a while, I bet you that they couldn't name 3 or 4 of those books or 3 or 4 of those organizations. And the reason you can't is because the abortion industry doesn't want you to know about them. Because if you knew that there were all these national organizations just to help post-abortive people, men and women, you'd know that dirty little secret behind the door they call choice, that the baby is not the only one who dies. Big parts of the mother die right along with them. And it doesn't get much better, Brendan. She keeps on dying, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and sometimes physically. Some of us do commit suicide until something either shakes her out of her denial, like, thank God happened with me at the confession, or, as happens far too often, she takes that post-abortion syndrome to her grave, never connecting the dots, never realizing that her migraines, her eating disorders, her relationship problems, all of that stems back to something that she might have done 30 or 40 years ago that she thinks she's supposed to feel perfectly okay about. And if she doesn't, society tells her there's something wrong with her.
Gee, wow.
There's a statistic that I quote all the time in when I'm speaking for groups and I also quote it in my book. If you are a woman and you've reached the age of 45 in the United States today, statistics say that you have had at least one abortion. There is a 45% chance that you have had at least one abortion.
Wow, that is something. So we're talking a massive amount of people here in the United
Oh,
States.
yeah. We're all around you. We are your mothers, your grandmothers, your aunts, your cousins, your sisters, your wives, your daughters, your coworkers, your friends. We are everywhere. If there's anybody within the sound of my voice right now that thinks they don't know someone who's had an abortion, there's only one reason for that. It's because you don't know who it is yet.
Now, you had mentioned in your DVD, which I highly recommend people get, what's the name of your DVD again?
The CD.
The CD, pardon me.
I don't want people to think they're going to see a picture. It is a listening device. It's called Through the Looking Glass: The Land Beyond Abortion.
And you had mentioned the name of Bernard Nathanson. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Who is he, and why was he important to you?
Dr. Nathanson is the very famous doctor who used to be an abortion doctor who had a big turnaround, just like I did, and became a very big mover and shaker in the pro-life movement. He wrote he made a very famous video called "The Silent Scream," which some of your listeners have probably heard and probably seen, where you can't see the baby. Where you can't hear the baby screaming as he dies in a saline abortion. Well, we are post-abortive mothers, and we're not only silent, we're invisible, because the society thinks some of us are doing so well. Like my friend Superwoman that I use as an example all the time.
Well,
It's 25 years later, and she has everything perfect, unless you look inside her head at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you'll see that her perfect husband is cheating on her with everything that walks, and she knows that too. She's in denial about that the same way she's in denial about her post-abortion syndrome. Her two perfect children, one has a very bad cocaine habit, which she also knows about, and the other one has an eating disorder, and she herself has the kind of migraines where you throw up every half hour. But denying that she's in that prison is not going to make those bars melt away.
Unless she were to seek the kind of help that you got. You had said that the confession process was step one for you. Are there any other steps that help you
absolutely.
grieve the loss of your child?
Yes, it is a step process. And in the back of my book, Dirty Little Secrets, The Truth Behind the Door, called Choice, in the back of my book, there's a whole list of national organizations that can help and websites that you can go to that can help post-abortive women. What helped me way back then in 95 was another book. It's called Her Choice to Heal. It's by Sidna Massey and Joan Phillips. Sidna Massey is Sydna-Masse, and Joan Phillips. Sidna Massey had one abortion. Joan Phillips had 3. And these two women take you through the steps in the healing process, one step at a time, in the privacy of your own living room, much like my book does. But it was the only thing around back then, and it literally saved my life, and it saved millions and millions of lives.
Now, you had mentioned also in this CD that I listened to that you had named your son. What did you name him? And,
one of the steps in the healing process is to name the baby that has died and to finally get to grieve and mourn that death. Now, I know that sounds really morbid, but it's not. It's a very necessary, very healthy thing that we have to do to get better. And I named my son Gabriel. About a year after my healing process began, I was watching this young woman carry a baby boy through our church hall. He was about a year old, and she had him up on one hip the way you carry kids that age. And she walked a little bit too close to the doorway, and he hit his head on the side of the door. and he started to shriek as only a 1-year-old can shriek. I mean, there are sirens with lower decibel levels. And anyhow, she put him down on the floor in front of her, and she got down on her knees in front of him. She started stroking his head, and she, "Oh, Mommy's so sorry you hit your head." And it was just like turning off a light bulb. I mean, immediately she had made it all better, and the tears stopped, and he was fine and smiling again. And then I thought nothing of it at the time, but it registered somewhere on my subconscious, because about 8 hours later I found myself on my knees in my apartment on my living room floor, sobbing and rocking back and forth and talking to my son, saying, "Gabriel, Mommy is sorry. Mommy is so sorry."
Wow.
You have no idea what that feels like, Brendan.
Wow. Must be
I'm glad that it happened, because it's part of my healing process. But what I do right now today when I speak to groups, and what I will be doing, hopefully until I leave the earth and go home, what I'm doing is so that you and nobody that you love will ever have to have a moment like that, because you'll never have to heal from something like what I did.
Well, now, what about the critics who would say to you, well, why dredge up all this pain regarding a past abortion? Why would you even want to even bring up the subject?
Yeah, I hear that a lot. I'll have people come up to me after I speak, and they'll say, "You're right. I do know somebody that's had an abortion, and she seems to be just fine. Why dredge up? She may be in denial, but she seems to be okay. Why dredge up all that pain if you don't have to?" Well, the other thing that I want you to remember after hearing me speak, besides the statistic that I told you, is that she's not fine. All right? There are studies being done right now at Harvard, where I've spoken twice, and at the University of Pennsylvania, that say that post-abortion syndrome, are you ready, is hormonal.
Hormonal.
Which means that it doesn't matter how she feels intellectually about the abortion. She could see abortion as the best thing that ever happened to women, and she is still going to experience some form of post-abortion syndrome. It is literally her own body not allowing her to forget what she did. I had one of my friends put it very poetically. He said, "It's blood crying out for blood."
Well,
Remember the two? There were two very, very famous cases. There was the woman that drowned her 5 children in the bathtub.
Yes.
And there was the lady that pushed her 2 little boys into the lake in the car.
Yes, I do recall that in recent times.
All right, we look at those 2 women like they're monsters, like creatures from another planet. How could they possibly do that awful, unthinkable thing? Right? And does anybody ever wonder what they're thinking in that little cell where they're going to be for the rest of their life? If they physically remembered what they did, the one that pushed her children into the lake might figure, well, I buckled him into the car seat, and he looked up at me and he smiled. I made sure the car was all tight, and I pushed it as hard as I could, and it started going down the hill. I watched as the car went into the water until all I could see was the roof, and then I couldn't see the roof anymore. Or the lady who drowned her children in the bathtub. Remember, I held him under the water as hard as I could. I felt his little feet kicking at me, and I watched the bubbles come up until there were no more bubbles. I mean, if they physically remembered that, they would start hitting their head against the cell wall and never stop, right? Now, are you starting to get the connection? Right? Yes, what they did was awful. All right? You would have to be pretty far in denial not to remember that, wouldn't you?
Definitely. So if
Okay?
abortion is...
What they did was awful. They drowned their children. I paid somebody to slowly dismember my son, who probably felt every single cut, and rip him out of the safest place in the world, his mother's womb. I paid somebody to do that. Yes, what Susan Smith and Andrea Yates did was awful. They drowned their children. But what I and millions like me did is 100 times more unthinkable.
Well, Vera, I thank you for sharing this. I do know you had an analogy of lung cancer is to smoking. What was that
That's right.
analogy that you mentioned?
That's a whole section in my book, Dirty Little Secrets, The Truth Behind the Door, called Choice. I want to make post-abortion syndrome to abortion what lung cancer became to cigarettes. After a while, cigarettes used to be very glamorous. You know, I'm old enough to remember the Virginia Slims commercials and "You've Come a Long Way, Baby" and all of that. But back when the big lung cancer thing came out, all we had to do was show people what happens when you smoke. You know, the people with the holes in their throat and everything, and it became so frightening and so awful to smoke that very few people started.
Right.
Okay, so we didn't have to make smoking illegal. All we had to do was show people what would happen if they smoked.
Well, Vera, unfortunately, we've run out of time here today. I wish we could talk further, and I'm sure I'll see you again in my travels down to the Washington, D.C. area.
I'm sure we will.
And I hope you found our show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Post-abortion syndrome is a serious condition of any woman and men who have had an abortion affect their lives. Well, thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.